Well, thank you. So my name is John Blyberg. I have been working in libraries for over 20 years in one way or another. I started out actually working at Lotus, that's just a British car company. This was in Ann Arbor way back when, but that actually got kind of boring working with sports cars, so I moved to libraries, which is way more interesting. So I'm going to talk about a number of different things today, mostly pertaining to sort of like the core piece of sort of the core technology that kind of drives libraries and discovery and authority control and that kind of thing. There's so much more that happens in libraries that I wouldn't be able to touch on it all today. You know, everything from, you know, electronic resource management to, you know, managing public PCs and print cost recovery and all that kind of stuff. There's just so much. But I'm going to kind of start with the basics. And I also, since I'm here and I'm talking to non-library folks, I assume most of you are non-library folks, I do want to advocate for libraries just a little bit. So there have been there've been like two inflection points politically for libraries in the 21st century. And this is not a political talk. This is just a little bit here. The first was following 9/11. And less than a month and a half after 9/11 happened, the USA Patriot Act was passed, and there was a clause in there that basically said that without a search warrant, without any kind of explanation, the FBI can come in and seize library patron data, and that could be anything from circulation data to you know, where you went on the internet and that kind of thing. That was a fight that libraries fought from basically 2001 all the way up through 2009. When I was a librarian in Connecticut, I worked with some of these folks were my colleagues. George Christian there on the left, he was the director of Library Connection, which was a sort of like a cooperative organization that kind of helps pool resources for smaller libraries, and they were known as the Connecticut Four. They were they weren't allowed to say who they were, and that was another piece of the Patriot Act, which was that particular clause, which was if the FBI came to you, you couldn't even tell your patrons that the FBI had come. So, you know, librarians are creative people, and my friend Jessamine West posted about this way back. This is an image from back then, and this was sort of one of the ways that librarians got around that kind of thing. So the other inflection point I want to mention is right now, and you know, librarians and libraries are under attack all across the country with in terms of books wanting to be banned. We've had death threats, we've had bomb threats, and we've had people defacing books and checking books out and burning them and that sort of thing. So we will continue to do our job, and I just wanted to make you aware that these are fights that librarians fight, have been fighting for the past couple of decades. And the people that fight those fights look like that, because those are librarians. So I want to kind of give you a brief history of the public library. So the public library as an institution, I think, is one of the two great exports of this country. So jazz and public libraries. The first sort of inkling of a public library was 1731. Ben Franklin, young man in his 20s, he got together with a bunch of other folks in Philadelphia and said, you know, books are really expensive. Like they're wicked expensive. I mean, back then they were, you know, if you had like 5 books, you know, you were, you know, but you know, those were basically wealthy landowners, and they had a lot of books, but they felt like, well, we want to have access to each other's books, so they kind of pooled all their books together, and they, for I think it was like 48 shillings or something like that, you could buy in, and then it was like an annual subscription. You could kind of go in and be a part of the Library Company of Philadelphia, and that's a picture of it. It still exists today. And then about 100 years later, Peterborough, New Hampshire opened what was called an association library, and these were not public libraries like we understand them today. Excuse me. They're more like they're public-private partnerships, right? So they were nonprofits, and they were privately run. They have a private board, but they receive some public funds. And these still exist today. In fact, the last library that I worked in was an association library, and it's a 501c3. And they mostly exist in New England because that was sort of the model for a while, and that kind of proliferated through New England before public libraries really took off across the country. There are some upsides to that and downsides to it. The upside is, if somebody comes to you and says, depending on how you kind of structure your funding, somebody comes to you and says, I don't like this book, you can go tell them to pound sand, because they'd be like, that's not taxpayer money, so you don't really have a say in this. The downside of that is that you actually have to raise that money, and so these libraries have active fundraising campaigns every year. And in 1848, Boston Public Library opened, and that was the first instance of a truly public library that was funded by taxpayer money, built by taxpayer money, and run by taxpayer money. And there's a whole lot in between that, time. But the general idea is that, in order for society to function as a free and open society, you need an informed electorate. And without having access to knowledge, you can't really have an informed electorate. And so the beginning of the 20th century was really sort of when the public library really kind of took off and spread across the country, mainly because of people like Andrew Carnegie, who funded, over $53 million worth of library projects across the country towards the end of his life, in the last few decades of his life. The largest concentration of Andrew Carnegie libraries are in New York and the boroughs, about 40 plus Carnegie libraries across the boroughs. We actually have 2 here in Lexington, and they're all over the country. And so that was really when public libraries and libraries spread across the country. And incidentally, does anybody know what those lions are called? No? That's patience and fortitude. So starting to get into the technology. So this is old technology, right? But this is still technology. The very first catalog cards that we are ever recorded, really used in a library kind of context, were written on the back of these playing cards, and those were. This is sort of an example of how libraries are truly revolutionary institutions. Those were cards that were used by soldiers during the French Revolution. And during that time, all of these libraries and all these books were seized, from the rich folks, and redistributed. And so there needed to be a way to catalog and know what books were taken and where they went and how to retrieve them, and how. Otherwise, it's just a pile of books. Eventually, in the mid 1800s, Harvard actually developed the beginnings of the card catalog system that we know today, and actually Alexander Graham Bell, along with Melville Dewey, came up with this. This is actually a very specific type of handwriting called library hand. And up until about a decade ago, you would actually have to learn library hand when you went to library school. 5 minutes? Okay. So that led to the catalog card, and you have a subject card and a title card and an author card, and you would get, you would have librarians organizing them, and this is a union catalog in Library of Congress. This is the same union catalog. This is the 1930s. This is the 1960s. So you can see how it had grown. This is obviously pre-computer era. And does anybody recognize this space? That's the King Library in the 1960s over at UK. And then we needed a way to categorize things and find things and label them. And does anybody kind of recognize what this represents? This is the Dewey Decimal System, right? I need to mention that Melville Dewey was an awful human being. He was a terrible, terrible human being. He was a misogynist, he was an anti-Semite, and a white supremacist, and all those things. So over the years, librarians have done a lot of work to kind of decolonize the Dewey system, but it's worth pointing that out. And then getting into the 60s, late 60s, Henrietta Avram develops a system called MARC, which was the machine readable cataloging, and this exists until today. I mean, we still catalog our records using MARC for the most part, and it's sort of like this. You look at it, and it's this artifact of the age of using cards to kind of input data, because it's all kind of stream based, and around that time also OCLC was created. OCLC was the company, if you've ever used WorldCat, OCLC is the creator of WorldCat. And believe it or not, back then the Ohio state legislature really encouraged libraries and funded them and put a lot of money into it. And so OCLC now is sort of like the Microsoft of the library world. I encourage you to take a look at, if you're interested in what MARC looks like. It's basically, it sort of mirrors Dewey in a lot of ways in terms of the 0 to 900s, but it's basically a way to kind of organize bibliographic records and item records together. It's being replaced by something called BibFrame, which will be interesting. Lee is going to talk about AI, and BibFrame I think will be a really important piece of that in terms of maintaining authority control across works in sort of a linked data environment. And then in 75, the first truly online catalog was created. It did not look like this. It was a Telnet login, but this was much later. Some of you might be familiar with this kind of catalog. These were basically like DEC alphas, that were on a token ring network, and you would kind of go in, or even just like a serial cables, and these were the original ones, and you can still find them today. I mean, this was obviously 2013. And then we were online, and back then, like, that was like super, like, cutting edge and amazing. There are some other protocols that are worth mentioning. Z3950, which if you kind of parse through this, it looks like an API, right? But it was developed in the early 80s as a way for systems to talk to each other. And then that was replaced by something called Dublin Core, which uses more of like a semantic web WorldCat was launched. Then Web 2 came along, and there were social elements introduced into the catalog. 2006, we've got 2006 to 2010. There was sort of this revolution of open source ILS systems. You know, an integrated library system costs somewhere between $90,000 and $200,000 to implement. Obviously, small libraries struggle with that kind of cost. So these are the two main open source library systems. So if you want to run a library system in your house, I think you can actually get Koha running up on Docker. So you can check books out to your kids or whatever. And then, you know, fast forward to today, you know, there are sort of this whole industry around these protocols, and you know, this is RFID, so a lot of materials are now tagged with RFID and used for like this is sorting returns and self-checkouts and that kind of thing. And that uses a standard called SIP2, which again dates back to the early 80s. So you've got these really modern types of technologies running on really old protocols to this day, with some attempts to update them. That's it. But you know, I think the thing to take away is that I don't think that's going to fit. There's been an attempt to kind of update a lot of these protocols and a lot of these classification systems so that we can be ready for things like LLMs and you know, and kind of maintaining a way to kind of have a sense of where information is coming from and what is even real. You know? And is this made up or not? So that's going to be the big challenge going forward.